In this video, I'm going to describe the Norgas case. Norgas is a made-up name of a company, but the data is from a real company. And this is a natural gas distributor in Eastern Canada. The natural gas industry, you should think of, there are three separate parts of it. There's the part where there's some kind of drilling and there are wells and gas is brought out of the ground. Then there's a long distance pipeline which gets the gas from where the fields are, which is usually far away from where people live. In the case of Canada, most of the gas fields are in Western Canada and most of the population lives in Eastern Canada. So you have these long distance pipelines. And then the third component is the local distribution. When the gas arrives in Eastern Canada, there are a series of smaller pipelines that lead to people's houses and to businesses. Norgas operates that third part, which is the local distribution of the gas. Depending on the country and the particular time to how it's regulated, sometimes all three parts will be a single company. A company may be integrated all the way through producing the gas to long distance transport to local distribution. In some countries and at certain times, it's broken into three separate pieces, and by regulation, you're not allowed to operate more than one of those three pieces. That is the situation, at least at this time in Canada, so that the local distributor, Norgas, actually can't produce their own gas and doesn't operate the long distance pipeline. They only do that local distribution. It's a fairly large company here. And because it operates only local distribution, and I'll highlight as I sort of go through these instructions, the key parts, they buy their gas from a major Western gas marketing organization, and they have the gas transported to their central distribution facility. So those other two pieces, they have to contract with somebody to do, and that's your job here on behalf of Norgas to negotiate and arrange for the contracts for the next fiscal year. So as in past years, you intend to contract with the supplier and the pipeline to ensure enough gas is able to meet the customer's requirements during a year that begins, pretend it's only 2010 now, so we're looking at the next year, April 1st, 2011. That's a fiscal year, runs through March 30th of the following year. So there are two different contracts, but there are two key quantities you have to fix. A is the minimum quantity that you will purchase during the year. So you decide what minimum quantity you'll agree to purchase. Could be zero. You could say, I don't want to promise any minimum, but you'll be given a financial incentive to offer a minimum purchase, because from the gas company's point of view, and this is mainly from the pipeline point of view, the long distance pipeline is largely a fixed cost. So it's really expensive to put in that long distance pipeline. Like almost any long distance pipeline is like that. So the fixed cost of the pipeline operator doesn't want to be dependent on how much people want to use it. Most of their cost was building the pipeline. They want to make sure that cost is covered, and what they'll do is they're going to sell capacity on that pipeline, and hopefully you are going to buy some of that capacity that offsets their fixed cost. So the minimum quantity, the more you agree to buy gas from the gas producer, the well producer, they'll offer you a price break. But from the pipeline's point of view, this is the key one, the maximum quantity that you may transport. So if you're going to pay for the right to transport gas on this pipeline, whether you use it or not. That's how they're going to cover their fixed costs. If you don't guarantee that you'll, if you don't contract for a maximum high enough, then if you want more capacity, you won't be able to get it. There is a version of this that's a little more sophisticated, which allows some storage so that you could use the capacity, and if you don't need the gas, you could store it somewhere at a cost, which utilities really do. And there isn't a version of this case, but in reality, there are secondary markets so that people can trade unused capacity and buy capacity from somebody else when they need more. Those features are not going to be present in this. In this situation, it's quite simple. If you haven't bought enough D, you can't put more into the pipeline. If you buy D, you pay for it whether you use it or not. So even if you decide to put nothing in the pipeline, you will pay D every day of the year because you have reserved that amount of the pipeline. So think of the pipeline as having a bunch of slices in it. You're reserving your piece of that pipeline. And you can use anything up to that piece. You can't use beyond it, even if the rest of the pipeline is not being used yet. It's off limits because you've only paid for this amount. And if you use less, you will still pay for this amount because that's how the pipeline is getting its fixed costs covered. If they basically slice up this pipeline and sell all those pieces to people, they've got their fixed costs covered because it doesn't matter whether you use it or not, you have covered their cost. You cannot have more than D delivered on any day, and you've agreed to purchase no less than A during the year. If you purchase less than A during the year, you will have to buy the rest. So you're going to have to pay for it whether you want it or not. There's a cost of transporting the gas on any given day from the supplier's gate, that's where it's taken out of the ground, to Norgas's central distribution point, which is where Norgas takes over control of the gas. The cost of transporting is given by a formula, A times Q, where Q is the amount that you're transporting. These are measured in 1,000 cubic meters. So Q is how much you're transporting. D is what you've reserved as capacity on the pipeline. And if you look at these two parameters, A and B, they've already been set, one at $13.32 per 1,000 cubic meters, and the other one is about twice as big. So B, which is multiplying times the quantity, the maximum quantity that you have arranged to buy ahead of time, is twice as big as the cost of moving the gas through the pipeline. So it costs you twice as much to reserve a unit of capacity than it does to actually push the gas through a same unit of capacity. And that's because the pipeline costs are mostly fixed and not variable costs. So the pipeline isn't that expensive to push gas through it. It's much more expensive to build the pipeline, and that shows up in these two prices. Every unit you want to push through the pipeline, you pay $13.32 for, but every unit of capacity you've reserved in the pipeline, you pay $26.51 for. Now, the purchase price for the gas, this is where A comes in. This is what you're buying from the gas producer. Depends on what your purchase commitment is. You'll pay $92 per 1,000 cubic meters if you only guarantee you'll buy 8 million 1,000 cubic meters or less for the year. If A is greater than 12 million, your price drops to $90 per 1,000 cubic meters. And if A is between 8 and 12 million, it has this formula, but you'll see this formula in the spreadsheet. It's basically a linear relationship from the $92 down to the $90. So as you go from 8 million to 12 million, the cost per unit goes from $92 down to $90. Below 8 million, it's a constant 92. Above 12 million, it's a constant 90. And between 8 and 12, there's a linear drop from 92 down to 90. So in terms of formula, the cost of purchasing some amount Q, 1,000 cubic meters of gas, and having it transported to the central distribution point. For every unit of Q, you have to buy the gas, so you're paying this amount C that we just talked about. If for every unit of Q you're transporting, you have to pay the A for transporting it. And for every unit of capacity that you've reserved on the pipeline, you're paying B amount. But that's multiplying not how much you put through the pipeline, it's multiplying how much you reserve to the pipeline. So let's turn to demand for a minute. Natural gas is used for cooking and water heating in residences, and also so cooking, water heating, and much of it says, oh yeah, water heating residence and source of power in industry, and in the winter it's also used to heat homes. So clearly weather is important. Temperature matters for the demand. The retail price is regulated here. It's beyond your control. It's got an average price of $211.78 per 1,000 cubic meters. So just a quick look at the numbers here, you'll notice that you're going to pay something on the order of $90 to $92 for every 1,000 cubic meters. You're going to pay somewhere like $13.32 to transport and $26.51 for a unit of capacity. So it adds up to about $40 there. $40 and $90 on your costs are on the order of $130 per unit, and your revenues are going to be $211 per unit. There's a healthy profit margin here. You'll see, though, it's not that easy to make money, and the reason is there are a huge amount of overhead costs that you have to cover. So we'll get to that in a minute. So in the short run, daily demand is a function of weather characteristics, and the two weather characteristics you're going to have access to data on is temperature and wind speed. It's been the practice of Norgas to relate actual gas demand not to the daily temperature, but it's something called degree days. You don't hear that term used that often anymore, although actually on the weather reports here, they do report what they call the heating degree days. And in my youth, that's always the way it was reported. The degree days is how far below some temperature is, that demands the need for heating. So if the temperature is high enough, you don't have heating needs due to the temperature being high enough, but every degree below that level is considered a degree day of heating. The further below, the more heating degree days you have. And so the formula looks something like this. The degree days are some key temperature T0, that threshold, minus the actual temperature, if the actual temperature is less than the threshold. If the actual temperature is above the threshold, there are no heating degree days. So the temp is the actual temperature. T0 is something you get to choose. It says here, practice varies. Norgas uses 18 degrees centigrade, but other gas utilities use temperatures anywhere ranging from 15 to 20. This is something you have control over. You get to choose if you're going to model demand using degree days, whether you want to use 18, or any other number you want to use. That's a decision you'll make. Consequences of excess demand and supply. You don't have access to storage, so at the beginning of the day, you place an order for delivery the next day. So, example, at the start of a Tuesday, so it's Tuesday morning, you have to order gas that you're going to need on Wednesday. If as the day progresses, it becomes clear that the demand is greater than what you ordered, then you're going to curtail demand by shutting off the gas to interruptible customers. All of this, you don't have to worry about, it takes place behind the scenes. You have a number of customers, usually large industrial customers, on interruptible contracts. They get a price break for this. They expect to be interrupted when your gas demand is more than what you have available. And in this particular case, you're going to find that you'll have to interrupt your customers almost half of the year. That's just a fact of life. If you try to satisfy all the demand all year, you will lose a lot of money. And the reason is, if you look at the demand here over the year, it varies tremendously. And so the days when it's really at its peak might be a couple of days in the winter. If you want to satisfy all the demand, you have to reserve enough capacity on that pipeline to satisfy this demand, but you pay for that every day of the year. So you're paying for capacity that you might use only once or twice during the year, paying for it every day. You can't make money that way. So your actual level of D is going to be somewhere in the middle of this varying demand, meaning that every time the demand is above what you reserved, you're going to have to curtail demand for your customers because you don't have enough capacity. Don't worry about that. It's not a big deal. It's expected to happen. You won't make money if you don't curtail the demand. At the same time, you don't want to curtail more than you have to, because with that healthy profit margin, or at least a potential profit margin, every unit of gas you can sell, you make money on. So if you have that demand there and you can sell it, you want to. So if you curtail demand too much by setting D too low, then you leave a lot of money on the table, a whole bunch of days when you have more demand than you've arranged for capacity for, and you're just not selling the gas. You don't make money by not selling gas. So it's a balancing act to set D at the right level. Okay, so weather is important. How are you going to forecast the weather? There are two commercial weather forecasting services available here. One's called Orion, one's called Polaris. Both at the start of a day will give you a forecast for temperature and wind the next day. So it's Tuesday morning, you will have a forecast from Orion and Polaris that says, here's what we think the temperature and wind will look like on Wednesday. If you want their forecast, you have to buy them from them. So Orion costs $60,000 for the entire year. Polaris costs $50,000 for the entire year. And I've added a third option here. Well, there's four options. You could not buy either. You don't have to use a commercial weather forecasting service. You could buy Orion for $60,000. You could buy Polaris for $50,000. You could buy both if you want for $110,000. That's one choice you will have to make, is whether to purchase a commercial service, and if so, which one or both. If you don't purchase them, what you can do is forecast the weather yourself. But there's a 2-day lag you have to account for. So the way to think about this is, it's Tuesday morning, you're ordering gas for Wednesday. If you have commercial weather service available, you can use that weather forecast in deciding how much demand you think there'll be on Wednesday. The other way around, Tuesday versus Wednesday. If you want to forecast it yourself, you can use the entire history that you have of weather forecasts, and you'll have 10 years of data here that you'll have to work with. But you have the latest weather you can use Tuesday morning is what happened on Monday. You can't use Tuesday's weather to order gas for Wednesday because you have to place your order at the beginning of the day. You can't use Wednesday's actual weather because you have to order gas before it happens. The latest available weather for you on Tuesday morning is what happened on Monday. That's a 2-day lag between the last observation and the day you have to order gas for. So the best you can do if you're forecasting on your own is use the historical record up until 2 days prior to when you're forecasting weather for, because you have to have that 2-day lag. There is no lag with the commercial forecast because they're giving you a forecast for that next day. So to show how this is all operated, I think it's easier to see if we switch to the spreadsheet here. This is the example 1 spreadsheet, and it's an abbreviated spreadsheet. It's just showing 1 month, April, and in fact, you'll notice if you look at the rows here, it skips from 19 to 39 just so it fits on the screen all at once. I have built out the entire year, and we'll look at that spreadsheet in a minute. So this is just an example of how it works, and you can see how the formulas work. The service is your choice. You can enter 0, 1, 2, or the third option, which is both. And depending on what you put in there, it will show up down here in the forecasting subscription charge. And with that third option, it's a little more complicated than this, but I've adjusted that on the expanded sheet. You get to set A, the minimum you're going to purchase for the year, and you get to set D, the maximum you can put through the pipeline on any given day. These are all fixed parameters: revenue per unit, A and B, the cost of pushing gas through the pipeline, and the cost of reserving a unit capacity. C is the cost of buying the gas from the producer, and that one's got a formula because it depends on whether you have agreed to order more than 8 million. So in millions, if it's less than 8 million, the cost is 92. If it's greater than 12, the cost is 90. And in between, it is this formula, which is basically a linear segment connecting the 92 down to the 90. So that's already embodied in this. Now, if you want to look at a single day here, so in this particular example, you've got a forecast from Orion for temperature, for wind, a forecast from Polaris for temperature and for wind. Oh, get out of that. Yeah. So these are just given information for to show you how it works for a given day. Now you have your forecast. So these are actually columns that you get to decide about. How do you want to forecast the temperature? In this particular example, which matches what's in the write-up, it says that they have decided to forecast the temperature themselves. What do they use for a forecast? M12. Well, that's, what was that? That's the actual temperature 2 days before. Remember, there's a 2-day lag if you're going to forecast it yourself. So I'm not saying there's a good decision. It's just an example of how it could work. If you want to forecast it yourself, you could say, I'm going to forecast the temperature to be what I saw 2 days ago, because you can't use any more recent information than that. If you wanted to use Polaris's forecast, instead of it equal M12, you would have it equal to Polaris's temperature. It would be equal to G14. But that's your decision. How do you want to forecast the temperature? How do you want to forecast the wind? Well, in this example, it says equal to H14. This company, in this example, decided to forecast the wind using Polaris's wind forecast. So that's why it's equal to H14. So you have control over what these two columns look like. What does demand look like? Well, that's something you have to decide. That's the biggest part of this exercise, trying to figure out how to forecast demand. This is not meant to be a realistic or good example for this case, but it is an example of what a demand forecast function, a demand forecast could look like. It says if the forecast temperature, which is I14, is less than, well, it is less than 18, one way of writing it as 18 minus the forecast is greater than 0. So remember that degree day thing. If the temperature is below 18, which is what Norgas has historically used, what's your forecast going to be? You're going to forecast 8,000 units of demand plus 910 for every degree day. So every degree below 18, you're going to add 910 to this base forecast of 8,000. If the temperature is not below 18, you're going to just say the demand is 8,000. The demand function forecast can be as complicated as you want to make it. This is a fairly simple one. The numbers are not necessarily meant to be realistic, so don't go by the numbers or even the form of this. You can make it as complicated as you want. Anything you decide to do to forecast the demand will be entered as some kind of formula, which in all likelihood, well, I'm pretty sure it's going to depend on temperature. It may or may not depend on wind. It may depend on other things that you have data on. So you will then decide what you think the demand is. How much demand will you order? Well, it's not the same thing as what you think demand is, because it is limited by what you set D at. Even if you think demand is going to be higher than D, you've set D for the year. You've agreed, I'm going to reserve this much capacity in the pipeline. If you think there'll be more demand than the capacity you reserve, you can't order it anymore because you don't have the capacity in the pipeline for it. So basically what column L is telling you is you will order how much you think the demand will be, unless you think the demand will be higher, in which case you only order what you've reserved under capacity. And you see an example of that right here. Here is a day when your forecast comes out to 37,575. Why are you only ordering 35,000? Because up here it was set equal to 35,000. All of these days where you expect demand to be less than 35,000, you order what you think the demand will be. It's only when it goes above 35,000 that you're limited to what D was set at. So you get to decide, these columns, you essentially get to decide column L when you set the value of D. Now what we have in column M, N, and O are actuals. So here's an example where an actual temperature, an actual wind is there, and the actual demand. And so now what do sales look like? Sales are going to be whichever of these is smaller, the actual demand or the quantity that you ordered. If you haven't ordered the gas, it doesn't matter what the actual demand is. You can't satisfy it even if it's bigger. And regardless of what you ordered, if the demand isn't there to use it all, you can only sell what is actually demanded. So the sales will depend on, in this first example, April 1st, you ordered 31,478. The actual demand was 33,573. You're only going to sell what you thought it would be. Here's an example. You thought it would be 35,000. You ordered 35,000. Demand only turned out to be 23,110. That's all it is that you're going to be able to sell. Once you have the sales, the revenue is straightforward because they just depend on using this price right here that you've been given. The costs are easy because you have to add on the cost of purchasing the gas, the cost of transporting that gas, the cost of reserving the capacity on the pipeline. All of those costs are included in figuring out the costs, and these formulas are in the spreadsheet for you. So you'll get whatever the gross profit is on that day. And the problem is going to, well, all right, so we add up all of the daily profit. Then there's an adjustment for shortfall. If in fact you did order in cell B1, if you agreed to buy a minimum that is higher than what you actually ordered, in this example, 900,000 is higher than the 891,270. You have to buy the rest because that's what it meant to guarantee you would buy at least A. So if there's a shortfall, you will have to add on that cost. You have your subscription charge for the weather service. There's a data collection charge. Used to allow people to make a choice. Do you want to order, how many years of data you want to order at a cost of, I think, $1,500 per year of data. But even though it's kind of nice to think that data is expensive and you have to buy it, I've seen too many teams basically order less data and then sorry later on because they didn't have enough data to work with. So I've made a decision for you. You will order 10 years of data and here's what you're paying for it, $15,000 for the 10 years of data. But you've got this big expense here. These are in thousands of dollars, everything measured here. That's $420 million of operating and financial expenses. So you've got a huge amount of cost involved with this big utility. And you've got to cover $420 million of expense on these daily operations. The reason why you lose so much money here is this spreadsheet only shows 1 month. There's no way you're going to cover an entire year of operating and financial expenses from 1 month. So don't worry about the fact that you lost $377 million. It's not consequential here. If you switch over to my expanded sheet here, it's the same basic sheet, except I've actually, let's unhide those. So format, unhide those. So I've got the full year put out here. You've got each of the days. The yellow is things you have to decide. This one too. Decide which weather service to use, and I've got the option for both in here. You have the minimum quantity you agree to buy, the maximum daily throughput in the pipeline you reserve. You get to decide what your demand forecast looks like. You actually get to decide your forecast of temperature and wind, but I'm not going to put that in this spreadsheet. I'll explain why in a minute. you'll have to fill in column K, you'll have to fill in column O. In the Excel spreadsheet, you don't need to fill in anything else. Once you fill in those 3 separate cells and column K and column O, the rest of the sheet will automatically self-compute, and you can basically look at how much profit you have. Even though your demand forecast will depend on how you're forecasting temperature and wind, it is far better to do that in JUMP than in Excel. So I'll talk about how you do that in a minute, but your modeling is going to be done in JUMP. Doing this kind of statistical modeling in Excel is just not a good idea. Excel is not a good environment for it. It has the capability, but it's a very awkward one to use. So you'll do the modeling in JUMP, and then you will pull out of JUMP the forecast of demand and the actual demand, just paste them in here, and then the spreadsheet will automatically show you how you did. Let's go back to the description. We've covered most of these things. I'll just sort of briefly go over it in the description. The numbers are just used for illustration. This is now referring to that example 1 spreadsheet. In that example, Norgas contracted to buy 900,000 cubic meters during the year, had no more than 35,000 transported on any given day, and they subscribed to Polaris, although they forecast the temperature on their own, even though they bought the forecast from Polaris. So the cost of buying Q amount of gas on any day and having it transported is, since 900,000 was less than the 8 million, they're paying $92 for the gas. They're spending $13.32 to move that gas through the pipeline. They're paying $26.51 for the 35,000 units that they reserved of capacity on the pipeline. So what that adds up to is basically this cost. So at the start of any day, you have Polaris available for temperature and wind. In this case, Norgas, despite having subscribed to Polaris, decides to ignore them and forecast it themselves, so they have the 2-day lag. So if the temperature forecast for April 3rd is the actual temperature of April 1st, the 2-day lag, April 4th would be the actual temperature from April 2nd because of the 2-day lag. And they used 18, although you could choose to use something else as their degree day cutoff. And their demand forecast, which again is just an illustration. And on April 1st, this is what it would look like. Because the forecast temperature was below 18, it was actually minus 7.8 degrees Celsius, which means it's below freezing. They actually have 25.6 degree days, 910 additional demand for every degree day. Added to the 8,000 base forecast meant that they were forecasting 31,478 for April 1st, which is what's in the spreadsheet. Okay, I think we've gone over all of this. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to receive 10 years of data every day for a full 10-year period. The data will look something like this. You will be given data on the year for the 10 years, the month, the date, what day of the week it is. You'll be given the full set of data on what Orion forecasts for the temperature, what Orion forecasts for the wind, what Polaris forecasts for the temperature, and Polaris forecasts for the wind, the actual temperature, the actual wind, and the actual demand. You'll have that for a full 10 years. Analyze that any way you want in order to decide what weather forecasting service to use, if any, or do it yourself, or how to forecast it yourself. What your demand forecast looks like based on what you think the weather will be and anything else that you have data on. What are you predicting for the demand? You set the values for A and D, and down here, these two, and then you'll see how much money you make. So the short instructions are: decide which forecast service to use, build a model to predict daily gas demand, decide on values for A and D. It says you'll be penalized if there are too many days you run out of gas, but it's not a separate penalty. It's built in, because if you run out of gas too often, you will be leaving too much money on the table, like I explained. If you never run out of gas, you're guaranteed to lose money, because you can't satisfy the peak demand of the year, which only happens once or twice. I have another document here which describes how you basically can test this out. So I said you're going to build, before your final submission, you'd like to be able to have some idea about whether you're going to make money or not. So you analyze your 10 years of data, you decided, you think how to forecast the weather, you think you have a demand model. Now the question is, can we test it out and see how it works? So what you should do is exclude the final year of data. So once you idea how you want to build the model, or you can even do this at the outset, take the last year. In theory, you could use any year, but let's just say the last year, exclude it. It says you can use any year, but this is what I'd call your test year. Then you build your model. It says you can start building models with the last year excluded, but then do you want to test it out? You're going to have to exclude that year before you build your model, just as a test of how it might work. So you're essentially going to use 9 years of data from the 10 years you have, and you're going to test it out on the 10th year. Whatever model you build, if you do save the prediction formula from the model, it will give a prediction for all 10 years. So even though you use 9 years, let's say the first 9 years to build the model, when you save the prediction formula, it will predict for the 10th year that was excluded from building the model. So you'll have forecasts for that 10th year. You copy the last 365 days of predicted demand and paste them into column O of the spreadsheet. Did I say predicted or actual? I may have reversed it. You paste the actual demand into column O, the predicted demand into column K. Let me make sure that that's right on this document. Copy the predicted demand and place it into column K. Copy the last 365 days of actual demand and do it in column O. And you only need to copy the actual demand once, because if you build a new forecast, you have that same 10th year of actual demand. If you change your forecast, just need to change column K with the new forecast. Build a new model, save the prediction formula, just paste it over whatever you had in column K. After you've pasted in the actual demand and the predicted demand, adjust the values of A and D so that your profit is as good as possible, and that'll give you a sample test of how well your model works. Since the 11th year is what your model is actually going to be tested on, your final submission will be for a year that you haven't seen yet. There are no surprises here. The 11th year is not going to suddenly have global warming if it wasn't evident from the first 10 years. It's not a different year. Nothing strange has happened. But the variability over the first 10 years is still going to be there for the 11th year. So the 11th year might turn out to be like the worst of the 10 years. It might be the best of the 10 years. It might even go a little bit beyond that one way or the other, but it's not a sudden surprise. It's going to be in keeping with what you've observed in the first 10 years, just that you don't have the 11th year to actually see. So this test is so that if you're able to make a fair amount of money from your model testing it on the 10th year, there's a pretty good chance you'll make money in the 11th year. If you're not making money, if you're losing money, or you're making very little, $1 million a year, then you're cutting it close. And if the 11th year is not a particularly good year, or the forecasts are off a little bit, then you might possibly lose money. So the task here is do a lot of trying different models. You can keep going back to the spreadsheet in order to see what kind of profits you make. And when you get to a pretty healthy looking profit level, then you can feel pretty comfortable that your final submission will be good. But from my experience, usually the first time you do this, you go through the first model you have will not make money. You'll probably be losing a fair amount of money. Or if you're suddenly making a lot of money right from the beginning, chances are you did something you weren't allowed to, like use the actual weather when you have to use forecast weather. If you knew the actual weather, you could do a lot better job of forecasting demand than if you have to forecast the weather. So you can't use the actual temperature and actual wind to predict the actual demand. You have to use some forecast of the temperature and the wind. So chances are if you did that right, then you will lose money the first few times, and it may take a few tries before you adjust your model enough to be able to make money. So if you're not satisfied with the profit result, build a new and better model and keep adjusting A and D until you are satisfied. When you make your final submission, of course, you don't want to exclude one of your 10 years. You want all 10 years to be used because you're really being tested against the 11th year of data that you haven't seen. But this allows you to sort of play out what it might look like with your final submission, because when you make your final submission, you're not going to get a second chance. If you lost money, you lost money. You can't say, oh, let me change my model again. So this is just so you can sort of imitate what the process is going to look like when you make your final submission without having to finalize your submission, because every time you test it on the last year from 9 years of data, if you're not happy with your result, just adjust your model until you get a model where you are happy with your result. So that's basically the instructions for Norgas.